All right, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me well in the back? Music's not too loud? All good, great. So I grew up in Germany, and I went to school in Switzerland, which means we're going to start right on time. Thanks for joining me here. So we're going to talk about actively scanning in OT devices. So I'm wearing Kevlar under here, because I know that that's an unpopular position to take, but bear with me and maybe we'll convert you by the end of this talk. So a little bit about me. I'm the co-founder and CEO of RunZero. I've been in cybersecurity forever. It's the only thing I know how to do. I started out back in Germany, came over to the States with PGP. Then NCipher Rapid7 is where I met my current co-founder, HD Moore. He's the creator of Metasploit, so they'd just gotten acquired by Rapid7 at the time. Did a little bit of incident response, then went to Veracode, and then when I got bored there, I hit up HD and he said like, hey, I'm taking some time off, and he said, do you want to come work here? And that's how we started together. So also in my spare time, I love social engineering and OSINT and those kind of things, and one of the things I'm proud of is that I won the DEF CON social engineering CTF a while back. A few years back. Thank you. It was a ton of fun. It wasn't all that much work. It was work, but fun work. And my life goals are, I want to learn all the skills that you commonly see in a heist movie. So I'm working on that. If you want to find me online, Mastodon, Chris _Kirsch at InfoSec Exchange, and Chris _Kirsch on Twitter as well. All right. So there's certain things in your life that you learned to be true at one point in your life. And those are, don't get into a stranger's car. Don't take your hands off the wheel. Only governments can issue currency. Work in an office so you make a good salary. And don't actively scan OT networks. And I'm standing up here and I'm telling you these might all no longer be true. They were true at one point, but I think they might no longer be true, and I'll tell you why. Now, I'm not saying that it's completely unreasonable what you might be thinking, because if I assume that many of you work or worked in OT environments, and with active scanning, probably many of you have had bad experiences. And what I'd like to do is to analyze a little bit why that is, and look at some of the reasons. Because if you really go through the reasons and you dig deep, you can actually avoid a lot of these problems. So one of the first things that, so let's assume that for active scanning you've mostly used either one of the vulnerability scanners, so like Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7, those kind of things, or Nmap, or any of the tools that actually have Nmap under the hood, which is a lot of the tools that are out there. So one of the techniques that a lot of these tools use to identify and fingerprint operating systems is to use malformed IP packets. Because some flavors of Linux, like if you just look at the banners and so on, you can't really figure out what the system is, like what flavor of Linux it is. But sometimes when you send like a malformed packet, then depending on how the thing responds, you can figure out what flavor of Linux it is. The problem is that with a lot of OT equipment, you've got really old TCP IP stacks. Embedded systems use either old or custom TCP IP stacks sometimes, right? Not as robust, not as tested. And when you send them these kind of packets, they choke. And they either reboot or they freeze up or something bad happens, right? So that's reason number one. Reason number two is aggressive security probes. So, a vulnerability scanner will try to do things, for example, like SQL injection, some other things that actually interact and really prod the device to figure out if it's vulnerable to a certain thing. If your device is not super good at error handling, it may just fall over, right? So that could be the web interface, could be other things, depending on what the security probe is. Next thing is heavy scan traffic. So some devices can just get overloaded if you send too much traffic their way. So if you, they just stop responding or reboot. And also, it's, sometimes the device needs to just respond in a certain period of time. So you don't want to overload the device and delay the response. So that's also very solvable. As a secondary thing, there's also some challenges with the middle devices. So if you scan through a device, a networking device, especially that is session aware, then you can have some issues. But that's the same thing as on an IT network, so it's not really all that different. But the end nodes being overloaded with embedded systems, that's a pretty common problem. And then once you've got taken care of all of these things, then you have still some really flaky devices. I call them snowflakes. I know it's not an industry term, but I think that's probably the best way to call them. And so these devices, even if you use all the standard conforming stuff and you don't do anything bad, they can fall over. Lantronix print servers are notorious for that. You scan them and you just talk to them on one port, and they're programmed to expect a very specific command as the next thing, and if they don't get that, they freeze up. You got to reboot them. So there are some of these, but they're actually relatively few and far between. So today, passive discovery is the standard in OT. And that is because active discovery has been kind of a no-go so far. So let's take stock a little bit, comparison between active and passive for OT discovery. So from a safety point of view, passive discovery is kind of like the gold standard, right? You're not sending any active traffic, so there is not a ton that can go wrong. So that's the main reason why people use the passive discovery. Then for deployment, deployment can be tricky for passive, which is why it's typically only used in OT environments, very contained environments. If you're trying to do passive discovery, let's say imagine, you wouldn't want to do this, but imagine the network of a Fortune 500 company. Covering all of that with passive discovery would be really, really hard, right? So you need to find the right choke points. You need to contain it to certain networks and so on. You need to configure the span ports. It's a little bit trickier than just than an active scan, for example. From a cost perspective, if you want to process all of that traffic, that's a lot of data. So you either need hardware, custom hardware, or pretty beefy VMs to do all the storage for the traffic and the processing and all of that stuff. And then in terms of completeness and accuracy, if a device is not talking or being talked to, you might miss the device or some of the ports that are open. And if you don't have a lot of traffic for that device, you might also not get enough data to really have a good fingerprint. You might have to guess a lot and you might be off. And then when we're thinking about what we're all preaching, you should start encrypting traffic on the network and all of these things and more encrypted protocols. Now passive discovery becomes more and more blind to a lot of things going on the network. So if we compare that with active scanning, the biggest thing, the biggest point of critique of active scanning on OT networks is the safety aspect. So here, if you use the wrong scanner or use scanners in the wrong way, those things can absolutely happen. And many of you have experienced that, and that's why active scanning is considered a no-go on networks. But if you avoid a lot of these risky scan practices that we talked about, then you can significantly reduce the risk. And you should test that test it and scan in maintenance windows, test it out on the network, and then you'll be fine. So this depends a little bit on the industry. Some industries have regular maintenance windows where that's very easy to do. If you're thinking about oil and gas, for example, they might have a maintenance window like 12 or 18 months out. So I think there it's less of a fit. But a lot of these other industries in manufacturing, we see a ton in manufacturing, that is a really good option. Then The deployment is easier because you deploy one scanner per network segment. You can get away with less, but then you're starting to lose fidelity. And the machine for that can be pretty lightweight. It's got lower cost system requirements. You have higher accuracy because you control all the traffic. You can send exactly the right data and traffic so that you get the maximum out of it. And it's not impacted by encryption, because if you're the source of the traffic, you can encrypt it, but you'll be able to decrypt it if you're talking to the end node. So how to scan ICS environments safely. So now that we know all of the things that can knock over devices or freeze them up or cause trouble, we know that we should, number one, only use standard conforming IP traffic. Don't send any malformed IP packets. Number two, don't send any security probes on these networks. Throttle the traffic per host so that you don't overload the end nodes. And probe for snowflakes. We're going to go into how to do that. And then test and scan in your maintenance windows. So throttling per host. The reason why people don't like to throttle their scans is because the scans just take very long. So especially if it's not your network, maybe you're coming in as a penetration tester and you only have a certain time and so on, or maybe your maintenance window is relatively short and you need to cover a lot of IPs, then throttling your scan down can be an issue. So a really good way to get around that is to say, all right, we're not going to throttle how much actually comes out of the scanner in terms of packets per second, right? So in this example, like, let's say we're scanning with 5,000 packets per second. But we should limit how much the scanner sends per second to each individual node. So the scanner will send, 5,000 per second, will send 40 to the first host, then 40 to the second host, 40 to the third, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, round robin, and then goes back to number one and checks, all right, is the second over? And if the range is big, then that's very likely. And you can actually scan a pretty big range, friendly towards the endpoint in a short amount of time. So that's how you get around that. And then for the Snowflake devices, basically you start out with the most benign traffic, right? So you start with like ARP and ICMP sweeps. Then you put in some device-specific UDP probes. So there's ways over UDP to identify a lot of these Snowflake devices. And then you say like, okay, is it one of these devices? Is it safe to scan? Or is it not? If it's not, you just abort, or you change your fingerprinting specific for these devices. If it's fine to scan, if it's not one of the really flaky ones, then you do a SYN scan over certain ports, but you don't do any fingerprinting traffic just yet. And you look at like, is this still good to use? And then if it is, then you broaden the set of ports. If it's not, same thing, you modify your fingerprints and you finish the fingerprint differently. And so that's what I mean by incremental fingerprinting, because you're not just sending the same traffic to every end node. You want to make sure that you cover your bases there and be very intentional in the steps that you do that. All of this stuff we figured out in our R&D team in the lab, but it's been years in production. So these are all customers or industries where we have customers that are using this in production. So across manufacturing, across transportation, telecommunications, et cetera, et cetera. So applies really broadly to a lot of industries. Oil and gas, for example, nuclear power, those probably not so much. All right, so I wanted to show you a couple of, these are redacted screenshots, but a few screenshots of devices we actually scan in production. The range is a lot broader, but I just wanted to give you a taste to show you, like, show me the money kind of slides. So here, PLCs, very common, right? So we scan those, we give you, what's the model number, the firmware version, all of those things. We grab screenshots. These things I talked about, these are this is an example of one of these snowflake devices that really behave badly when you look at them funny. So you need to do really good incremental fingerprinting for those. BACnet devices, so this is for smart building automation, for example. Then HMI controllers, you get the thing. And then sometimes we find like really fun, weird things like drone detectors. Seen those on like railway systems, utilities, and so on. And for those, you can even detect that they're running an out-of-date operating system in the embedded device. So that can also be super helpful. So taking your first steps in active scanning, start small and start slow, right? Limited to a few devices. You want to start getting comfortable with the technology. Go through the steps that I indicated in terms of the types of things that you should be doing early on and the decision trees and those kind of things. Then work within the maintenance windows so that if you get a parameter wrong and so on, that it's safe to use. Then start to go into bigger segments and plan your deployment. You can do this yourself if you're good with active scanning technology, building your own, those kind of things, or using some of the more configurable scanners. Or you can also come to our website. We have all of these things pre-configured so that your path to success is a little faster. All right. Thank you very much. Remember, some things used to be true for good reasons. They may no longer be true today. And I encourage you to try that out. Thank you. All right, I ran through this super fast. We have so much time for questions. All right. Yeah. Okay, so the question is like, who's accepting the risk, right? So with any technology that you're deploying, you have a certain amount of risk that you're introducing, right? If you're deploying a database, you need to make your due diligence. You're deploying it with the right hardware on it, and you're maintaining it, and you're configuring it right, and all of these things. It's no different here, right? There are a lot of things, a lot of technologies that if you apply them wrong, you can screw things up, right? This is no exception. So, yeah. Yeah, all right. All right.
Doing the incremental approach, it looks like you're actively scanning devices that you know about. What's your approach for finding devices that you don't know about or scanning for those?
Yeah. So, we have different deployment models, right, in terms of how our customers can use this. And the technology works on, we use a combination of active scanning and API sources to gather like full asset inventory across IT and OT and cloud and remote. So when you scan with us, you can either have the console on-premise and in SaaS, and I'll get to your question in a second because this is important, right? When we scan in the SaaS environment, you can give us access to your data so that we can go in and fingerprint a lot of the devices. And so we have, I think to date, we have about 600 commercial customers, and we have over 20,000, I think it's 22, 24,000 free users. And so all of this data helps us with the fingerprinting. So we've seen a lot of devices in terms of commercial customers, you know, over 1 million assets and so on. We have a lot of tech enthusiasts, is what I would call, you know, many of the people at this conference that have all sorts of weird stuff at home in their network, right? And they scan it at home, and the free edition goes up to 256 devices. We get a lot of really cool data there that we can use in our research and development to dial in the fingerprinting. and take kind of like almost like a data science approach to fingerprinting. And for most companies that have an on-premise only approach, or an approach where it's tough for them to access the different customer environments, they just don't have the sample data. They don't have it's incredibly hard to build a comprehensive OT lab. I've talked to so many people, and not even like the industrial control system vendors have good labs. And it's crazy to me because you're like all of this stuff is in production, right? And so we have a very good sample size of millions of devices that we can use to tune the fingerprinting and all of those things. Yeah. All right. And if you find a device on your home network that for some reason we don't have yet, there's a little button that says improve fingerprint. You can tell us what it is, and then we bake that into the next release of the product. All right. There's a question over here. Yeah. 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 So most of the time, customers come to us because they're having trouble with the inventory. They're using either EDR agents or vulnerability scans. And with the EDR agents, you can only inventory any device that takes an agent, right? And devices that you know about. If it's I've had customers where like they've had a disaster recovery site, they forgot to put it on there, or it's a development box and they forgot to put it on there. If you've got like your Cisco Polycom phone, or like Polycom phone, different companies, Polycom phone on your desk, like those cannot take agents. The HVAC system can. The surveillance camera, like all of these things that are now connected to networks, sometimes segmented, sometimes not, you can't get through an EDR agent. Second thing is with vulnerability scanners. Vulnerability scanners are really good at finding vulnerabilities, and they give you, your book of all the vulnerabilities that you have on the network. They're not very good at figuring out what something actually is, especially if they don't have credentials to scan it. So our scan doesn't do any specific vulnerability checks at scan time. And we focus exactly only on like what is the hardware, what is the operating system, what is the software on there, anything that's discoverable from the outside. So for IT networks, that could be, you would be surprised the kinds of things you can find out through an unauthenticated scan. So one of my favorite ones that we find is like a Kaspersky endpoint scanner that shouldn't have any ports open. Now, there shouldn't be anything on the network, but we can still discover it because they're leaving some traces in certain protocols. And so we can get actually pretty deep into that. And then the networking devices as well, we can do that authenticated through SNMP or unauthenticated. With SNMP, we're getting a little bit more, right? But most people are bringing us on because the vuln scanners and the EDR agents weren't enough in giving them insights. And then we can also tell them, we can ingest those sources too, which gives us more depth on the devices that the agents are on, for example. But it also tells you where you're missing the agents, right? Because we scanned this window box over here, but it's not showing up in CrowdStrike, for example. Yes. OT and IT and cloud, like it's all in one system, yeah. Yeah. All right. Okay. Any more questions? Oh, sorry, I didn't see you behind the thing. Yeah. So with the incremental scanning, the question is, do we do that inside the product, and especially with new devices? So we are, yes, so the product takes care of that automatically. It's not something you configure in the product. because it's very nuanced and like the sequencing is complex. So we bake that into the product, and yeah, you just run the scan. The biggest thing you need to be careful of when you're deploying is the scan rate coming out of the scanner, the per host settings. Both of those we have pretty safe defaults. And then scanning through any device, any networking device that's aware of sessions or tracking sessions. Because if you're scanning through a networking device and it tracks a session for every port and every IP on the other side, you can quickly overload the device. But that's also true for vulnerability scanning and so on, because you just need to be a little bit aware of the infrastructure. All right, any more questions? We good? Yeah, one over there. Sure. So liability, it depends on the contract. So like financial liability, you mean? Yeah, that's a contractual requirement. Contractual agreement that we can discuss in private, but it's not something I would say up here on stage. Thank you. All right. All good. Thank you very much. Appreciate all the questions.